This is an Irreverent podcast. Check out irreverent.fm for shows from all our friends. Hello, I'm Blake Chastain, and this is Powers and Principalities. This show focuses on the systems and institutions that prop up white evangelical power and influence in America and the world. Season 1 is focused on white evangelicalism and Christian nationalism. I'm delighted to share this conversation I had with Diana Butler Bass with you. I had initially planned for this conversation to provide a survey of the early development of fundamentalism in white American Christianity, but our talk went to unexpected places. We ended up talking about trauma responses, and its role in spurring some later developments in American Christianity. To that end, it felt like a bridge between this show and Exvangelical, the podcast I've been hosting for the past 4 years. Diana and I talked back on May 4th, 2020, and a lot has happened in America since then. The unjust death of George Floyd on May 25th sparked a nationwide reckoning with America's original sin of racism. Protests were organized across the country as people were moved to collective action even amidst an uncontrolled pandemic. If this conversation fails to capture or reflect the urgency of that moment and all subsequent moments, it is because when we spoke, they had not happened yet. This episode was produced by Jake Lewis. You can support the show by rating and reviewing it on Apple Podcasts and by subscribing to my newsletter at postevangelicalpost.com. Without further ado, let's get to this conversation with Diana Butler Bass. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of the new show, Powers and Principalities. My first guest is Diana Butler Bass. She is an academic and author of several books, including Christianity After Religion, A People's History of Christianity, and her latest book is titled Grateful, The Subversive Practice of Giving Thanks. Diana, thanks for joining the show.
Well, it is an honor to be the first guest on your new podcast.
Well, thank you very much for coming on. I really appreciate it. I wanted to have you on this show because you really excel at communicating about American religious history to popular audiences. And you also studied under George Marsden at Duke, who's a major figure in the study of American evangelicalism and fundamentalism here in the United States. And that this show is really all about giving context to that side of American Christianity, understanding the history of fundamentalism and its relationship to both the religious right from around the 70s up to now within Trumpism is just really, really important to understand what's happening politically and socially. So with that in mind, where and when did modern fundamentalism begin to take shape here in the United States?
Well, with every historical question, that is an argument that historians have. I was trained by Marsden, and I think that the way that he taught us the story, and that I think is faithful to the evidence, is that it really began in the late 19th century. The general way of understanding American religious history when it comes to evangelicalism and fundamentalism is that much of Protestantism throughout the 19th century had an overall evangelical cast to it. That evangelical and Protestant and Christian kind of all meant the same word. And, it meant mostly a kind of Protestantism that was personal, that took Bible reading seriously, that was not institutional in its strictest senses, really elevated the priesthood of all believers, certain kinds of distinctives of Protestantism that took hold in the United States. But you get into the late 19th century, And that overall sort of evangelical ethos of American Protestantism began to be challenged by a whole range of issues. The issues were internal theological ones, because in the late 19th century, you begin to get the development of biblical criticism and historical understandings of the Bible that really rock the whole world of Protestantism, not just in the United States, but in Europe as well. So you have those kinds of internal issues, and then there's a number of issues related to social change, like immigration and economic concerns, things that lead to the development of the social gospel, issues that begin to prompt questions about race and ethnicity that people don't necessarily deal with terribly well. And so you have those internal questions, and you have these external
Hmm.
sort of social movements pressuring uh, evangelicalism, and then there's also a whole bunch of scientific issues that come to the fore about creation and the age of the earth and geology and biology and evolution, and all of those things began to really sort of tear at the fabric of Protestantism. And it's in that pressure, with this whole set of internal theological issues, large social changes, and scientific ideas, that you begin to develop a split within American Protestantism. And that split creates sort of two large camps of Protestants, with a whole bunch of people in the middle, trying to avoid the trouble, as it were. Because that's always the case. There's always a whole bunch of people in the
Right.
middle who
Yeah.
look
Just
at all these kinds of arguments and say, "Wait a second, that doesn't define me." But but nevertheless, you get these two kinds of very loud, very public
right.
groups that start to argue. And one group says, for the most part, that Christians can accept scientific change and have to deal with the social problems of a given age, and that there's nothing to fear about biblical criticism. And that group becomes known as what was first just called liberal evangelicals, and then later shortened to liberals and then modernists. And then the other group, who said, no, you can't do any of that. The scientific findings have to be taken secondarily to the biblical narrative, that these kinds of social changes don't matter because the gospel is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And then the theological issues, they were just mostly unwilling um, to look at the kinds of biblical criticisms that were developing, and said, no, the Bible, you just read it straightforward. And so that group, who began to really say, we already had everything we needed, that the gospel has already been preached, and that all we have to do is reassert the traditional interpretations and the traditional doctrines, and everything will be fine. And that group became known as fundamentalists.
Do you think it's fair to describe those fundamentalists as reactionary against all of these different social and intellectual changes? As you mentioned, they're like within the realm of Christianity, there was what is called the social gospel, which is very oriented towards addressing social needs. And then it was the response to German high criticism that led to the development of a lot of fundamentalist beliefs, as well as all these social things. Do you think it's fair to use a term like reactionary to describe the way in which these fundamentalists basically dug in and said that this is actually the way in which we should understand the scriptures and understand our relationships with society?
I think that, had you asked me that question maybe even 5 years ago, I would have said yes. That's fair. But I think now I kind of see it a little different way. The word reactionary itself is, it's a really loaded term. And
Mm.
if we think of the sort of the what it was like to live in the late 19th century, which I actually think we as early 21st century people can have a lot of sympathy for. I see a lot of similarities in the sort of the cultural anxieties of the late 19th and early 20th century here 100 years later. And so what I think happens at any given moment in the historical timeline is that stuff occurs, new ideas come up, new books are written, new idea, kind of new patterns of community come to the fore. People who haven't previously had voice begin to express their voices. And all of that causes reactions among every group of human beings.
Hmm.
And so now, when I would have said one time, oh yeah, the fundamentalists were reactionary against liberal culture and that they were just trying to, protect themselves against all these changes. I think that probably the fairer thing for me, fairer way for me to think about it at least, is that human beings react to change. And the people who became Protestant liberals were reacting to change as well. They were reacting by saying, these ideas are worth listening to. Maybe there's something here that we can learn from. Maybe we haven't always understood what Jesus intended in terms of living in a just universe. And so they were reacting. Their adaptation was a reaction to those things. And I think the fundamentalists were doing the same thing as well. As they were also reacting, and they adapted. And so what I think is the false narrative is that either one of these two sides emerged from the 19th century into the first years of the 20th century, maintaining a kind of Protestantism that had been practiced, say, 50 or 70 years before.
Mm.
Both groups reacted to social change and intellectual change, and I think also internal pressures within their own tradition, and they formed two different pathways, really, of adapting to those changes. And so I would rather think of that as adaptation and transformation rather than just being quote unquote reactionary because of the nature of the word reactionary.
It does have a loaded connotation for sure.
Yeah, it does. And in this conversation, I think, one of the things that's really important to do is to try to, what any good historian is always trying to do is put herself and him or himself, back into the narrative and say, how would I feel? How did these people see their moment? And so I think that, very few people were were standing there, kind of imagining themselves, you know, in a way that was negative. They saw themselves as the heroes of their own
Hmm.
stories. And, one group, the more modernist and liberal types, were heroes in their own story. They believed that they were protecting or saving Christianity by adopting these new ideas, and fundamentalists had the exact opposite approach.
Yeah, and I am certainly sort of showing my cards a little bit as being someone that moved from more conservative faith of origin to one that is more open or more liberal, for lack of a better word. So I appreciate the way in which you responded to that question, even the way in which I worded it. So thank you for exploring that with me.
Well, it makes a difference, I think, into how we read the stories, because I mean, I can look back in the history of fundamentalism and want to tear my hair out because I journeyed through evangelicalism as a personal experience, a personal narrative, um, mostly in the 1970s, 80s, and 80s for about 15, 17 years of my life. And so, kind of coming out of that on the other side, I had very strong reaction against it. And that was very problematic for me because I had considered myself an evangelical all the way through my undergraduate, my seminary education, and even into my PhD when I was studying with Marsden. And so my personal identity was wrapped up in the historical narrative that I was studying. And while I was working with this historical narrative, I always wanted to give it the benefit of the doubt because I wanted my tribe to look good, yeah, which is true for a lot of the people who are well-known historians in this field. Mark Knoll does not want Mark Knoll, who taught at Wheaton for years and then Notre Dame. He doesn't want evangelicals to look bad. Those are his
Right.
people. George Marsden did not want evangelicals to look bad. Those are his people. And so what you try to do as a historian, and I'm so grateful that I studied with these types of thinkers. It was almost all men because there were very few women in the field back then. There was only one woman of real note, a woman named Edith Bloomhofer, who studied the history of Pentecostalism. And so, most of these people I studied with, they were on a real mission to understand what had been good about their own tribe. And that meant that they approached fundamentalism far more sympathetically than any other generation of scholars since the argument started, 100 years ago. So I wear that, I hope, still well, even though I think I struggled with that. As soon as I found myself in a much more liberal place, I sort of wanted to go back and, sort of trash the fundamentalists historically, but I found that I really kind of couldn't. And, I think that for people always think of me as a pretty harsh critic of fundamentalism. They have no idea how much harsher I could have been. you know, all along the way. And I actually, because I sort of stepped out of the place and I had less invested in then trying to defend my
Mhm.
tribe, I think I'd actually kind of see the history of fundamentalism in some very different ways than a lot of my colleagues who were either liberals who wanted to run it down or who were, kind of tribal elders who were doing great work, as I think good historians should do, but who were nevertheless personally invested in ways that they wanted to tell the narrative in its, you know, most glowing terms, as it were.
Yeah, and there's obviously so much to critique and so many negative experiences within fundamentalism. These are definitely not always the easiest things to talk about, and it's definitely not something that can all be summed up in a single conversation. But I do totally understand that perspective too, just in that a lot of people come from this background, and it is understandable how people think that way, even if they develop a different way of thinking later. And that doesn't discount someone's experience, and it doesn't discount the injustices that are perpetrated through these things and through a lot of these beliefs. But to your point, these were also people trying to understand a vastly changing world, and that is definitely something that we can relate to in our current moment in history.
Yeah, and I think that it's always a good practice, to kind of travel back that 100 years and to uh, continually look for the things that surprise us. My One of the things that liberals hate to talk about, for example, is how incredibly poorly Protestant liberals handled Jim Crow in the late 19th century. You can look pretty far and wide in some of the best liberal theology and even social ethics in the late 19th century and find any mention at all of lynching or Jim Crow or the quote unquote race problem. As a matter of fact, you'll find kind of some stuff of the opposite that's really unpleasant and very hard to deal with. And that is, you do find within some of those theologians a fascination for eugenics.
Mm, mhm.
And one of the downsides of liberalism is that when it was looking at new thinking, one of the ways that was considered to be kind of new thinking about the race problem in the late 19th century was around the emerging science, quote unquote, of eugenics. And so, the same people who on one hand said, Charles Darwin is right, and that doesn't that doesn't undermine uh, us being Christians, that we can believe in evolution and believe in Christianity. If you had asked those same people about what they might think about eugenics, they would put eugenics in the same category with Charles Darwin. And so there's a problem, if ever there was
Right.
one. And then you've got a host of problems that develop within fundamentalism about particularly hierarchies, race and gender, a real inability to be able to, what are the best words trying to think of? It, they The gatekeeping impulses of fundamentalism were so extraordinarily strong, and so there was a kind of, I think, almost institutional terror factor that gets built into early years of fundamentalism, because if you cross certain lines, you're considered to be out.
Right.
Um, and at one point, I actually wrote a paper that was never published. It was right as I was sort of leaving evangelicalism. I have these papers, 3 of them, on the history of fundamentalism that remain in my files as unpublished work. But I wrote a paper on an early president of Biola University, Bible Institute of Los Angeles, in the 1920s, 1930s. And this president of Biola pressed against some of the edges of fundamentalism. And the institutional and sort of gatekeeping powers of the new fundamentalist movement came down on him like a ton of bricks, and eventually ruined his life. And that's been a pretty constant thread in fundamentalism, is the destruction of individuals for the sake of what they feel like is truth.
Right.
And so neither one of those things is, either what I explained about liberals a moment ago, sort of their critical acceptance of all forms of what they perceive to be science, or fundamentalists' fascination with making boundaries and the control of other people is really part of the problem. But then you've got this goofy thing that happens, like with Pentecostals. People hardly ever talk about them, but 100 years ago, there were some very radical forms of Pentecostalism. There were Pentecostals who were so close to being Marxists that you can almost not separate them or politically from one another. A lot of Pentecostals were involved in labor organizing, democratic socialist movements, flirted with the edges of Marxism. There are papers written about how Pentecostals in the 1930s paved the way for the New Deal and FDR during the Great Depression, especially in California.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a whole book written called The Vision of the Disinherited, which is a radical interpretation of the lower class roots of Pentecostalism. And of course, Pentecostalism in its earliest stages was fully integrated. And so here you have these kind of two things, liberalism and fundamentalism, with this other weird kind of cousin growing up on the sidelines.
Mm-hmm.
And all of this is happening in the early 20th century to American Protestants. And so, what's unexpected here, is like, this is a really interesting story. And we don't pay attention to all of its unanticipated edges.
Mm. Yeah, that's a very good point. And so much of what we are talking about has sort of been default talking about the white church, and things like the Pentecostal tradition, as you mentioned, have a lot more ethnic diversity and representation in that regard, that whenever we're talking about these sorts of things and the history of what becomes the religious right, that is oftentimes discussing primarily white experiences.
That's correct.
Mm-hmm. Even though this is a presidential election, there are many more candidates on the ballot besides the president. Go to Ballot Ready for a nonpartisan guide to your entire ballot. From there, you can compare candidates based on stances on issues, biography, or endorsements, and then save your choices to use when you vote by mail or in the voting booth. You can even request your absentee ballot or make a plan to vote early or on election day. This election matters. Make sure you have a plan to vote and vote informed. I do want to talk a little bit about another key historical point in that early 20th century period, which is the Scopes monkey trial. And again, using the word reaction, just the effect of that verdict. For some time, it was sort of considered as if the fundamentalism went, quote unquote, like underground around that time. But that is not really the consensus anymore, I don't believe. How did that affect the way in which these groups that had begun to codify and begun to formulate formal institutions? There's a lot of Christian colleges that were founded in the 1920s that became and are still around 100 years later, that are more conservative, evangelical, that sort of bent of a Christian college. A lot of them were founded around that time. But how did that particular historical event affect that conversation amongst, again, using these broad terms of fundamentalists and more liberal Protestants?
I can't believe you actually are asking me to talk about these things, because my longtime editor, who is now my literary agent, he has been begging me for the last 5 years to write a new history of this very time period
Mm.
of fundamentalism and evangelicalism, beginning in the teens, and especially how the Scopes monkey trial has an impact on American Protestantism going forward. And I think part of the reason why he wants me to write a book is because I am dissatisfied with a lot of the interpretations of what happened. And you named one of them. And one of those interpretations is, well, there was the Scopes monkey trial, in which the professor who taught evolution was put on trial by the state of Tennessee for teaching Darwin, because teaching Darwin was against the law in the state of Tennessee. And of course, John Scopes was the name of the teacher, and he was found guilty of teaching evolution. And he was fined, I think it was $1, $10, very little amount of money, for his crime. So in effect, what happened was, the anti-evolutionary forces, although they won, in a very sort of narrow sense of the word, winning the case, they lost, as my old friend Randall Balmer likes saying, they lost in the court of public opinion.
And I actually misspoke when I said that the verdict was in favor of evolution. It was,
Oh,
and
yeah,
that was me. That was me misspeaking, because I was thinking about the public opinion, not the
right.
actual.
and I was actually so much thinking about 1925 that I didn't notice that you had said that.
Yeah,
But
so that was my mistake. I want to correct that on the air here.
and that, of course, is what happened historically.
Mhm.
And so what historians have done with that has been interesting over the last almost century now. And one group of historians say, oh well, liberalism won, and then they go on. And if you read a lot of histories of American religion, particularly ones written in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, you would have seen a kind of a triumphal sort of depiction of the liberal tradition in America. And that begins to kind of get all messed up, with Jimmy Carter getting elected president in 1976. It's like people said, well, wait a second, where did this come from? Evangelicals, some Southern guy who's talking Jesus, and what, how, and so the narrative was liberals won and fundamentalists went away. Well, then the narrative became, well, hey, liberals seem to win. Where did these fundamentalists come from? And so the first take was, oh, it was regional religion. It was mostly confined to the South. And then the second take on it was that these groups had consigned themselves, to the margins of American culture. But the more recent, and I think the better uh, understandings is yes, fundamentalists did, I think, feel defeated in certain ways in the mid 1920s, particularly related to scopes. But it didn't cause them to go away and sort of lick their wounds on the margins of culture. It pushed them into a new kind of creativity.
Mm-hmm.
And that creativity begins to express itself in the founding of a whole bunch of new institutions, new mission boards, new seminaries, new Bible colleges. I went to one of those schools. I graduated from Westmont College in California, which was founded in 1940. And so that whole the late 20s, the 1930s and 1940s, while a lot of American religion was kind of in a slump due to the Depression, fundamentalists were kind of surprisingly regrouping themselves and said, okay, well, if the New York Times doesn't want us, we're going to go ahead and start our own publishing houses,
Mm-hmm.
And so there was a lot of surprising and creative investment that fundamentalists were making in a world that they could see would that they hoped would emerge sometime in the future to have a more prominent public voice again. So if like I said, if you look at them fairly, you do see more going on there than just a bunch of hicks who have been embarrassed by elite culture and who take their wounds and run away. And so those are kind of the interpretations that are present, sort of in our culture. And the thing that I'm playing with and that I'm really interested in is, this is kind of weird to say this because it's kind of out of fashion historically. Not much I can do with it, but I'm kind of become very interested in a psychological interpretation of American Protestantism in the 20th century. Now, what I think happened around scopes is incredibly important. And I think what happened was you get this narrative that begins to appear in the press around scopes, and if you just look at it objectively, in some ways, it's a really kind of nasty narrative, and that is the people who are holding to the fundamentals of faith and who are biblical literalists are all depicted as sort of unwashed masses of people who don't think about anything. And I mean, they're depicted as hicks. That's where that's kind of you actually get language like that that's used in major northern newspapers and in radio media about the people who are involved in Scope's monkey trial. And so all of a sudden, there are people within fundamentalism who do understand themselves as intellectuals, who went to places like Princeton Seminary and who are the pastors in churches, not just in small southern towns, but in northern towns and cities. And they kind of maybe, they actually hold to these fundamentals, maybe not in the same way that is being demonstrated in Dayton, Tennessee at the time, but they are sympathetic to not going fully with Darwin. And they're pretty well educated people. And now all of a sudden, all fundamentalists are being painted with this same brush of being these rural, unwashed masses who really aren't worthy of serious attention in the culture. And so when they lose in the court of public opinion, as it were, that does something to them.
Mm-hmm.
I can't imagine. George Marsden, his own father, was one of these well-educated Presbyterian conservatives. And then all of a sudden, George would sometimes relate this story when in class, is that when he was a young boy, he couldn't figure out why all of a sudden his neighbors were like making fun of his family when his father, as a conservative, resisted some of the more liberal moves made in the Presbyterian Church. And what this did is it really created for the Marsdens, this kind of sense of, well, what? We're the same people we've always been, and why all of a sudden are people turning against us? And so I think that this narrative that the liberal America embraced about fundamentalism, that they were hicks and uneducated and had nothing to say to the world and all this kind of stuff, I think that psychologically made fundamentalism kind of worse.
So just that their pride had been wounded so many times in that regard.
Yeah, sure. Any of us who are treated with that kind of derision, go into a place of extraordinary defensiveness. And what then I think what happened is, to use this language that I think a lot more of us are familiar with now, is I think the Scopes monkey trial created a trauma for conservative Protestants, some of whom identified with the word fundamentalist. And that trauma then becomes the template on which their reaction takes place. And so, okay, so and now this is the place where I think you could tell the story of American Protestantism really differently. Because here now you have a group of people who have a worldview, admittedly, that is about gatekeeping, that is admittedly unwilling to engage certain kinds of ideas in the culture, that is very interested in boundaries, that really wants order, and it prizes order. So that's the worldview of these conservatives. That was their adaptation to emerging liberalism in the early part of the 20th century. And then they feel that all of that has been assaulted in the worst, most undignified way possible in this large national media sort of frenzy. And so they move into a place where they feel incredibly traumatized. And what happens when you're a traumatized person is that your first thing you want to do is you want to fight back. You want to, and so how they fight back is that they come at liberal Protestants as hard as they can. And they, heresy trials and name calling, and say that liberalism can never be Christianity. And they remove themselves from liberal institutions because they feel like they cannot be polluted by the contagion. And so what you have then is now liberals are sitting on the other side of this, and they're going, well, wait a second, hey, calm down, we're Christians too, we're Christians, we believe in the Bible, we worship God, we have Sunday school, we love our children, we're doing missionary work. And yet what happens now, then the next move is the people who have been traumatized they're full of shame. They're trying to project their shame out into the world. And what do? But they turn around and they scapegoat their own cousins in the very denominations that they've just left. And they say, you're the problem.
Right.
And anybody who's being scapegoated, they respond to that, and they say, well, to the person who's doing the scapegoating, either, well, you don't exist, or you don't matter, or we told you so. We always knew that you were really awful people. And so it reifies the original complaint. All it does for the people who are now being scapegoated is it makes the people who are carrying this sense of shame for this trauma, it makes them dig their heels in. And so what I really think we have in 20th century Protestantism is this, American Protestantism is this endless sort of cycle of shame and scapegoating. And it's never resolved. And all it does is it keeps getting passed down into new generations.
So do you think that that sort of response makes them unable to do you think that makes them unable to admit that when it came to the original thing in question, which was this trial, they can't even accept that scientific consensus has moved on because they are more wrapped up in the response to the consensus and to the embarrassment that followed. And then that is what sort of feeds the culture war as because they have stayed in sort of particular, as you've mentioned, like hierarchy is important, and any additional information that threatens a hierarchy is viewed as a life or death style threat.
Correct.
I understand both perspectives.
Hmm.
However, the way in which culture wars continue to play out
Hmm.
within these groups, and now, like you fast forward 100 years, and now there's at least two entirely separate media ecosystems in which someone can exist.
Hmm.
Someone can exist in a world in which they, um, the I've heard it as the 4chan of Fox News pipeline, of like a deeply conservative type of belief and interpretation of objective events, and then you have the other side of media of the left, and however you want to classify that. Yeah, it's just hard to hold that and see that across 100 years. But do you think that that's part of a struggle for a fundamentalist is separating a catalyzing event from the emotional response to it?
Yes. And this is where a whole different kind of science comes into play. And in the last couple years, and all these different things, like I said, my interpretation of fundamentalism has really changed radically in the last couple years. And part of it is because I've spent time reading a lot about trauma, and shame, and also processing some levels of these things that are part of my own life,
Mhm.
which I've written about as well, as a survivor of sexual assault, and then also as a survivor of religious trauma, I would say as well. So I think what happened, is that the original thing, this argument that happened within. If we have to always remember that American Protestantism sort of held itself very proudly out as America's religion for all of the diversity that existed within American Protestantism in the 19th century. And there was a lot of it, and people love to argue between Methodists and Calvinists and all these kinds of different things. There was nevertheless this sort of sense of American identity as a Protestant nation, and that was a very sort of um, proud marker of what it meant to be an American in the world, um, especially as the United States was leaving its infancy and becoming a global player, the Protestant nation, as it were. And so it was within that sense of identity, we're Protestant, that this dramatic kind of uh, fight occurred, really, and this breaking up of this sense of identity. And so you get to these events in the 20s, and I think that they were led up to by a whole series of events, but when they happened, it crystallized it. It became the sort of prism through which the past would be seen and the future would be interpreted. And it doesn't surprise me, we're talking together on the day that marks the year anniversary of Rachel Held Evans dying.
Mm-hmm.
And that her first, and she's from Dayton, Tennessee, and that her first book was called, Evolving in Monkey Town.
Mm-hmm.
And it was about this very thing, about growing up really in the heart of where this crisis, happened. And the point is, what I have learned from science and psychology and from sociology and all the different kinds of things that inform my larger work, it's a theologian and a historian, is that there's this field that's emerging as a very exciting and interesting field. It's called epigenetics. And the idea of epigenetics, and it's the research, it's very deep, the research in this field is very profound. And what it's showing us is that trauma imprints patterns not only on the people who go through the trauma, but on the DNA of the people who go through the trauma. And when the next generation is born, that DNA, the DNA that was affected by the trauma, is altered in the next generation.
Mm-hmm.
And that we actually pass trauma and potentially things like shame about trauma and our reactions to trauma, we actually pass those on to the next generation of people biologically. And most of this work is done around two different kinds of trauma survivors, Holocaust survivors and their families. And so a lot of it's being done in Israel and is in Israeli universities. And then another body of the research is being done around sexual assault and people who are born to people who are born to people who are sexually abused. And so all of this research is showing that our DNA actually gets twisted or deformed or broken in different ways by trauma, and that goes biologically into the future. And so what I think that shows us, and what researchers are arguing, is it shows us that people who are born to trauma victims have they're predisposed to certain kinds of emotional and physiological responses, just in the same way a person who has, say, a cancer mutation in their genes, if you put them into certain kinds of situations environmentally, they're more likely to develop cancer than somebody who doesn't have that mutation. And so now we're discovering that that's true about trauma as well, is that you can carry around a trauma gene and you would be just fine. But if something happens to you that is like a trauma that might have been imprinted in your genes by an ancestor, that you have the trauma mutations, as it were, in your gene, is that you will react as if you are being traumatized. And so in the same way, a person with a trauma or the cancer mutation has to avoid the environmental threats, has to live a healthy life, has to make certain kinds of health decisions. They're developing treatments before the development of cancer that can potentially keep people from developing cancer. That's what we have to do with trauma as well, is what this research is beginning to suggest. And so my question becomes, if that is true for individuals, why isn't that true for traditions? And I really think that what has happened is that what we have lived in for the last 100 years with American Protestantism is that it has been a traumatized religious tradition broken into two and more families as a result of the trauma. But the two main families have spent the better part of the last 100 years um, shaming and blaming across this field of unresolved trauma. And that has done untold damage on American culture because, of course, the largest religious tradition through the 20th century was American Protestantism.
Yeah.
And it still is the largest, even though it's not as large as it used to be. But I actually think that its very decline is a result of this unresolved trauma.
Hmm. It's a very interesting way to think about institutions and the ways in which they develop and the way in which they respond to one another, and the ways in which they dialogue. I mean, so much of this, there's this sort of stuff is endlessly complex, and a lot of what we're talking about hasn't touched on things related to America's original sin of slavery and racism and how that factors into all of this. This is definitely not how I thought our sort of conversation would go and developing a sort of sympathy for the fun for amongst fundamentalists and all of those things, but it's appreciated because it's such a fascinating way to think about these institutions and the ways in which we exist in them. Because I mean,
Right.
it connects. There's a lot of disconnects in American society. There's so many. One of them being, generational. And so sometimes it's hard for someone who's a millennial or younger to relate to someone who's a boomer or older, and contextualize their experiences. But when you put it within the scope of history and say these sort of initial traumas from over 100 years ago are still playing out in our, like they were playing out in the lives of the silent generation, the greatest generation, the boomers, everyone up to now.
That's correct.
It's
Mhm.
fascinating.
And for me, it does a lot as a historian. It gives me another lens into the larger story. And you ask questions about like the Fox News sort of world and the world of like MSNBC and the Nation and all those kind. We have these different sorts of
Hmm.
places to go. Well, in a sense, the Fox News world and MSNBC are the logical descendants of uh, this trauma. Is that they're the development of places where people want to be kept safe,
Hmm.
where they don't want to be called hicks by a bunch of elitists, and where they don't want to be called heretics by a bunch of Southern yahoos, and that's the way the story has been imprinted on us all.
Hmm.
And now, instead of just working itself out in your local Southern Baptist church and your local Unitarian Universalist congregation, which is the main some of the main places of public discourse of earlier generations, what used to be a distinctly religious trauma has moved into a far more secular space and has had huge impacts on our media, on our educational systems, and on our political life.
Hmm.
But I really do think that it has to go back to, at least in part, this unresolved trauma from the early decades of the early 20th century. So it helps us understand those big questions. But I don't know about you all. You how like I don't know how old you are. How old are you?
I'm 36.
Okay, and I'm 61. And what it does, I think, in an interesting way for both of us, sitting in very different generational sort of places, is I always wonder to myself, why did I ever join a fundamentalist church of my own free will?
Hmm.
I mean, I wasn't born into it. I joined it because I was at one point in my life looking for order and clarity, especially if you were a teenager in the 1970s. And today's also the anniversary of Kent State, which happened when I was 11 years old.
Hmm.
And, when you are an 11-year-old and you watch we all watched the same television. We had 3 channels. We watched all those same 3 channels. And that news came on that night. That's the first news story I remember in its fullness. Watching people who were in authority shoot down students who were not that much older than me. And my whole sort of teenage years of the 1970s then were set into this question about chaos and fear.
And one of my first ones is Columbine, which is,
Oh, yeah. Oh, gosh, yes.
and I was home. I had an appendectomy, and so it was the first live news event I remember watching unfold in that way as an adolescent, as like I think a sophomore in high school at the time. Both shootings, yeah,
Yeah. And, so then as my own journey unfolded, I chose to become an evangelical because it felt safe. Whereas my own tradition, I grew up in a more liberal Methodist church, talked glowingly about things like ambiguity and questions. And I love that now. But when you're 11 and you've seen Kent State on your television, it's like, no, I don't want questions. I want order. I want somebody to make me safe. And so my experience helps me understand why I went, towards fundamentalism. And it helps me understand that in a very sympathetic way. But then, when I got out of it, I I carried with me for many years afterwards a sense of guilt and maybe even internalized shame that I had surrendered my own intellect and my own power to this religious group
yeah,
that that asked me for it, really demanded it from me.
right.
But I did it willingly. I mean, I was like a victim of Stockholm syndrome.
Hmm.
And so I felt terrible about that. And yet it really wasn't until I got to this point where I started thinking about trauma and shame and blame and how this whole big history unfolded and how that big history interacted with my own small history, that I could let myself off the hook.
Yeah. What you're sharing reminds me of an axiom from Marshall McLuhan. He would always use the term electric man. And he says, electric man lives mythically and all at once, meaning that when our media, as it's been ever since the dawn of TV, has been so instantaneous, and it's only accelerated now, like with Twitter, like there's a cultural event every 2 hours.
Right.
The way in which we respond to that, as you said, big history and small history, it does push you towards things that can help you make sense of the universe. For sure. And for a lot of people that does happen by gravitating towards conservative or fundamentalist traditions.
Right. And so one of the things that I asked and it doesn't necessarily have to be fundamentalism right now in the strictest sense of fundamentalism as we knew it in 1925.
Hmm.
Because see, you actually said the very thing that was the most important, that the epigenetics conversation can point us towards, is that even after the originating impulse is gone, the mutation of the DNA remains. And so you might not necessarily be triggered ever again. If you say your grandparents or your great grandparents were those people alive in 1925,
Hmm.
you could be a person who would never be triggered by evolution, but you could be triggered by something else to move towards authoritarianism or a profound need for order or the need to blame or scapegoat someone else because you feel like they've infringed on the boundary that you think is the most important thing. So, see, it doesn't have to be evolution. It doesn't have to be German higher criticism that triggers you. The gene mutation is there. And what could trigger you could be any other kind of event that makes you feel unsafe or makes you feel less than or makes you feel like some elite person is looking down at you.
Right. Yeah.
And and so it could be, you know, anything. It can be almost anything. And that's why the gene has to be fixed.
Right.
you know.
Yeah.
so um because it just shows its head. And I do think it shows its head almost hourly on Twitter.
Yes, it does. Yes. Oh my goodness. Oh yeah, for sure.
Such a shame and blame culture. I mean,
Mhm.
Twitter itself is like the shame and blame machine.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
And and to me, I've actually made personal commitments. It's very hard because Twitter creates a culture where that shame and blame thing is valorized, and I have certainly fallen into it at times. And man, as soon as I do it, I either try to take down tweets that I have misfired, or on occasion I've
yeah.
apologized to people, different things like that. But I really have committed myself. It's like, how do I live outside of this kind of traumatized culture that has created these pathways of shame and scapegoating over the last 100 years?
Right. Yeah. It's very hard because, as you said, it's gamified on Twitter. Like it's all about visible, quantified reactions and retweets and likes and replies and all those things. And yeah, it hits all sorts of receptors in your brain, dopamine and otherwise,
Yeah,
and wanting to respond and defend and lash out. It's yeah, it's not always the best place if you're a traumatized person.
right.
I've really been fascinated by the sort of turn that this conversation had. I didn't sort of expect to be talking about trauma within the context of institutions, especially over the course of 100 years. But it's been very enlightening in that regard. I do want to bring things back to sort of the present moment that we're living in. There were some things about the development of the religious right and that I think we could save for maybe another conversation another time. But we are living in this moment of there being a world historical pandemic and frankly, a failed response from our federal government to address this before it became a pandemic. And one of the results of that is that we are seeing culture wars sort of being waged by people that are Christian nationalists and other types of conservatives. You know, we can throw around a lot of different labels and we can nitpick them if we want, and that's totally fine. But one of the things that a lot of people that might be familiar with the type of culture wars that have been waged between fundamentalists and the broader culture, especially as the way they see the way fundamentalists tend to frame it is it's fundamentalism versus secularism and the broader culture. Now we actually have this instance where the public health of our country is being threatened by people that insist on churches meeting in person, pushing for reopening because capitalism is God's chosen way in which to spread wealth. Like there's all sorts of arguments out there, but what is your read on the way that is being presented by those more conservative groups and the way in which they frame their arguments, as well as the ways in which you may have seen other religious groups? And feel free to not use the way I'm doing conservative and liberal. Use your own terminology as you like. But other easily called progressive denominations and denominations of all sorts and religions of all sorts are using technologies and other things to continue to make community. I know that that's a two-part question with a lot of preface, but I wanted to sort of contextualize the question a bit and just say how what's your read on both reactions to this particular moment in history that we're living
Oh, well, your question is huge.
in? Yeah.
And
It's not-
and my easiest answer is, I think that the religious traditions that are like what I would call the brand label religious traditions,
yeah.
rather than saying conservative or liberal, but the
Hmm.
brand label sorts of traditions. So the Methodists and the Presbyterians and the Eastern Orthodox and the Catholics and the ones that have the familiar old fashioned signs and buildings. They have, I think, generally, taken the science, pretty seriously. And um, even when they didn't want to, it shut, most of them have shut their churches. Most of those denominations are not holding services and have not been for the last 2 months, including through Easter, which is just was very hard on them. And so I think that on that side of the coin, you have an enormous amount of what I call fear, sadness, and grief. And so the fear is when will anybody come back after we've been closed so long? Because a lot of those churches are in decline. And then the sadness is missing one another, missing familiar patterns, missing their friends in churches, missing their rituals and their rites. And a lot of them, frankly, have had to go to online kinds of services, and that's not been easy for them, because these have, for by and large, been the churches that have been most resistant to the technological revolution that's all around us. So that's been very hard. And then grief, I they believe the science, they believe the numbers, and they're seeing the deaths, because a lot of these religious traditions are full of people who are older, and they're watching the memorial services stack up that they're going to have after they can safely reopen again. And they're also not able to do the kind of ministry they normally would do, because we're not supposed to touch one another, and that's just huge. So I think on that side of the score, you do have a sense, you have responses and reactions that are full of all those three things: fear, sadness, and grief. And on the other hand, I think evangelicals have the very sort of more radical evangelicals and conservative evangelicals have lived inside of a world that doesn't believe science by and large for a long time, so that they were pretty skeptical to begin with, that all this was happening. Not all of them, but many of them. And so I think they were much slower, to close down their churches. And then they pulled off of this history of persecution that they have. And so the idea is that liberal cultures and elites have wanted to persecute them. And so this, using the pandemic as an excuse to close their churches down, it becomes a sort of heightened sense of paranoia. Again, they're replaying 1925 someplace in their minds. Is if we don't stand up for the truth, if we don't resist the secular hordes, they're going to permanently take away our religious freedom, or they're going to close us down forever. And so they pulled off of those persecution complexes that have been part of that shame culture for a long time. But then I think, obviously, those traditions also have a very high view of the miraculous. And it's often tied to their views of the end of the world. And so, there's this idea that the faithful will be protected from the virus.
A remnant, that sort
Yeah.
of, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so, you can have a service, and God will take care of you, because God is with you. And what we've seen from that, of course, is we've seen pastors die, who have done that, and it's really sad. So that high sense of God's providential care, which is always true, God does care for all of us, and God does take care of humankind, because God loves humankind. But God does not do that to the expense of using common sense, But in evangelical and Pentecostal universe, it's all God and no common sense. And so that's been problematic. And then that gets tied into their ideas about the end of the world, is that this is God's judgment against sin, or this is God ushering in the last days, or what have you. But there's a lot of that out there as well. So I think that those are kind of the frames in which the two larger sorts of religious bodies in the United States are existing. That sort of larger, more um, traditional, mainstream brand name, whatever you want to call it,
Hmm.
group that has taken science seriously, but is still afraid, still very sad. Um, it's full of real grief. And then the more the heirs of the fundamentalist movement and Pentecostals who have elevated the miraculous, who see this as God's divine intervention, bringing about God's plan for the end times, and who see it as persecution.
Yeah, and it's hard to see the human cost on both sides, just because that's all the grief we're all having to hold right now
Yeah,
in this moment. So
yeah, and I think that actually is one thing that we might, as we are able to re-enter into space with one another, is that on both sides of that ledger there has been the loss of life
hmm,
and
yeah,
and the loss of things we love.
right, yeah.
And in that sense of lostness, maybe, who knows, maybe there can be some new paths of finding healing for what has been broken for a long time.
Well, I really appreciate the way in which you've contextualized things. Again, it did not occur to me to really think of these things within the frame of trauma. That is definitely the way I approach things in the other podcast I do, because it's more about people's lives and their roles in this, their individual roles. But I'm very thankful for the way in which you've posited this idea of trauma playing out amongst institutions and throughout history, and it's given me a lot to think about. Where can people find your writing, and wherever else you might be online?
Well, I have a website, dianabutlerbass.com. People can follow me on Twitter at Diana Butler Bass. I have a public Facebook page. I don't use that quite as much as I used to, but it's there under my name, Diana Butler Bass, as well. And my books, I just finished my 11th book. It's not for sale yet. It will be out sometime early next year. I've written a book on Jesus, which is kind of fun. Um, and a surprise to many people who know me, you're finally going to talk about Jesus in a book. So I'm really looking forward to that book coming out. But my other things on history and social change and spirituality, um, any bookstore, Barnes and Noble, Amazon, all your local and independent bookstores can get all of my books. And I hope people will be interested in hearing some of the words that I've put into the world. I've always tried to heal,
That's
and
great.
always try to make the connection between our individual lives and the history that we make
Hmm.
simply by being alive together in this moment. So our individual lives matter. They become the stuff of history, even
Yeah,
if we ourselves don't become a famous name.
that's right.
Together, we're making it.
That's right. I totally agree. Diana, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Oh, it's been a pleasure, Blake. And I'm glad, congratulations on this new podcast. And um, I hope it does really well.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you very much.